Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph will begin Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis at the end of the last line. We were in the middle of the sugya. We wanted to demonstrate that Rav Papa, even though he himself suggested that Abba Shaul holds that in order to be chayav the chaimish for truma, you need both requirements. It has to be at least a shova pruta and at least a kazayas. That he was chayav from that. We brought a brisa that says as follows. The brisa says that the pasuk says v'chata b'shgaga prat lameza, that the din is that it's only b'shogeg that you bring the korban. It's chata b'shgaga, and it's prat lameza. If it's a mezid, then you don't bring the asham. So the asham me'ilah is only brought if it's done b'shogeg, not prat lameza, not the mezid. Then the Brisa asked the question, why do I need a pasuk for this to show me that the Asham Me'ilas is only showing not b'mezid? It's kal v'chayra. Other mitzvahs that have koros, so there is a korban that's brought for other mitzvahs. For instance, by chaylev and dam, if a person eats from it, then if he doesn't b'mezid, he's chayav koros. And in b'mezid there's koros, there's shogeg, there's a korban, but there's no korban for mezid. There's no korban for mezid, even though they're more chomer, that b'mezid there's koros. Me'ilah, where there is no koros, b'mezid, there's misa b'dei shemayim, but there's no koros, certainly in a din that it should be potter b'mezid, then there's no korban. Then the Brisa said, no, that's not a kal v'chaymer, because by shar mitzvahs, by, for instance, chaylev and dam, there's no misa b'dei shemayim. But by Me'ilah, there's Misa B'dei Shemayim. That's why you need the pasuk that shogeg prat lamezid. And the Gemara was bothered, right? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, he said to Rav Chia bar Avin, the Tana initially took the assumption that it's a kal v'chaymer because koros is more chomer than Misa B'dei Shemayim. And then it asks a pirka, asks a kasha, and says, no, Misa B'dei Shemayim is more chomer. So what is the Tana holding? So he explains it as follows. He says, don't say by shar mitzvahs. What it means to say is not that Misa B'dei Shemayim is more chomer than koros. The hanocha was that koros is more chomer than Misa B'dei Shemayim. Koros is more chomer. It's haylach hariri. It's more chomer. What he means to say is initially he says that therefore it's a kal v'chaymer, and if there's no korban b'mezid by shar mitzvahs, certainly there's not by meal. But then it said no, maybe it's not that way. Maybe it is because shar mitzvahs, we say, there's no misa b'dei shemayim pachas mikazayis. If it's less than a kazayis, there's no misa b'dei shemayim, there's no koros. If it's less than a kazayis, and there's no misa b'dei shemayim, it's tamer b'me'ilah that even though it's less than a kazayis, there is misa b'dei shemayim. So therefore, me'ilah is more chomer. That's why you need the pasuk. So therefore, when Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak heard that, he said to Rav Chia bar Avin that Tanuch dait v'shinachta dait. Then he said to him back, why is it nichusa? Because Rav and Rosh Hashanah, they swung an axe at it, they upshlugged it. So what is the pircha? What is the upshlag? So this is where we're holding. So right at the end of the last line. So man shamadle the Omer, who's the one that said that you heard that said Hazed b'milah b'misa? Now this is based on the premise. The pircha is that by mi'ilah b'mezid there's mi'ilah. Who is the Tana that holds? That's Rebbe. That's Rebbe that says by mezid there's misa b'dei shemayim by mi'ilah. It's funny Hazed b'milah. If he's mezid b'mi'ilah, Rebbe Omer b'misa, it says misa b'dei shemayim cham Omer b'azhara. They say no, it's not misa b'dei shemayim. It's allowed. It's allowed, but there's no Misa B'dei Shemayim. There's Malchus, but not Misa B'dei Shemayim. My time of the Rebbe, why does Rebbe say there's Misa? He learns Gzera Shava Chet Chet Mitruma. Meaning the Torah doesn't say Beferish and Azara by Me'ilah. We learn out Gzera Shava, which the Chamor also mighted to. But however, Rebbe says we learn out Gzera Shava, and therefore we learn as follows. Ma Truma B'Misa, just like by Truma. It's the mezid of truma. There's misa b'dei shemayim. If a zari is the truma, so therefore af me'ilah b'misa. Similarly, that me'ilah there is misa. There's misa b'dei shemayim. Umina, and extended further. Ma truma b'kazayis. Just like truma, it's also if there's a kazayis. It's only if there is a shear of a kazayis. Af mi'ila b'kazayis. So, therefore, mi'ila would only be if there's a kazayis. So, the Gemara is saying, therefore, Yishana ban Nargin. How can you say that the Pirchan the Kal V'Chaimer, and therefore we need the pasuk of Shkoga Pradal Mezer is because the Pircha is because Mi'il is more Chomer because there's Misa B'dei Shemaim and less than Gazayas. How do we know that B'chlal there's Misa B'dei Shemaim? That's the sheet of Rebbe that we learn out from Chelchel Mitruma. Well, if that's the case, it's not less than a Gazayas, it's only a Gazayas. Because Rebbe holds that Truma, Ma Truma Gazayas, of Mi'ilah, is Begazayas. So you have no kasha. So that can't be the pshat. Umask v'la Rapapa, and Rapapa asks on this. He asks on this kasha on the premise of Rabbi and Rav Sheshes. Mimai the Rebbe Karabanan really. How do you know that Rebbe holds like the Rabbana? How do you know that Rebbe holds like the Rabbanan? Dimla Kavashol Sfirle, Domer Yeshba Shava Pruta. Afagav the lesbe kazayis. How do you know that the criteria is a kazayis, and therefore you're saying that ma truma b'misaf mi'il truma mino ma truma b'kazayis af mi'il b'kazayis, and therefore you say that it can't be the pshat and the bryce because mi'ila there's no chi of mi'ila if it's less than the kazayis. No, how do you know that Rebbe holds like the Rabbanan? How do you know that they hold like the Rabbanan that holds that you have to have a kazayas? Maybe it holds like Avashol that you don't have to have a kazayas as long as it's a shava pruta. Now, Varapapa would amar Avashol Tantiboy. Now, Rapapa himself, previously we learned that he held that Avashol, he suggested Avashol says you need both. They're both criteria. It has to be both a minimum of a shava pruta and a kazayas. Alashmam, Hadar Bay. You see clearly over here that Rapapa was chayzer, and he held that no, according to Avashol, you don't need both. That the criteria according to Avashol is a kazayas. According to Avashol, the criteria is a shava pruta, and according to the Rabbanan, it's a kazayas. Now we brought down this brisa, and we had the brisa that, so we've proven the point that Rapapa was Hadarbe, but now we brought the brisa that says that we have the pasuk of B'shoigeg, and by Mi'ila B'shkoga, that's Prat L'Mezer. Why do we need the pasuk? The brisa said we have a Kal V'Chaimer, and we had a Pirchan the Kal V'Chaimer, so that's why we need the pasuk. Now we have a different interpretation of how to explain the brisa. The kasha was that the brisa initially assumed that Koros is more chomer, and then it has a kasha the Misa B'dei Shemaim is more chomer. So, does the Tana holding that Koros is more chomer or not? So now we have different explanations of this brisa. Amar Breder Vino Amar Hachikama. This is the pshat in the brisa. Lo'im Amrat B'Shar Mitzvah Shlo Yasbem Shem Miskav Kimiskav. Don't say that by Shar Mitzvahs you're telling me that it's a Kal V'Chaimer. You're telling me it's a Kal V'Chaimer. That you should say that if Shar Mitzvahs, which is Chomer, which there is Shar Mitzvahs is Chomer, that is Koros, and yet there's no Korban B'mezid, certainly Mila, that certainly by Mi'ila, which there's no Kores, certainly there should be no Korban B'mezid. So what do you need the pasuk? No, I have a kasha, I have a Pirchan the Kal V'Chaimer. This is what the brisa means. This is the Pirchan the Kal V'Chaimer. Lo yimrame b'shar mitzvahs. Other mitzvahs you're telling me is chomer. I'll tell you it's not chomer. I have a kasha. I'll show you a kula. Shelo yasam shem miskaven kimiskaven. That we don't treat if a person is not miskaven like he is miskaven and he's chayiv, and he should be a chayiv for it. Meaning, what does that mean? For instance, by Shabbos, if a person intended to cut something which was not growing from the ground. So there's no malacha. There's no malacha in cutting something not growing from the ground. The malacha of kaiser is something growing from the ground. Now, if his kavana was to cut the tola shulchata chasamachubar, but inadvertently he cut something growing from the ground, so inadvertently there was that ksira, shepater, he's pater. He is pater on that. We say it's not a malach's machshavas, and he doesn't have a chiyuv for a chatas in such a case. Tzaymer b'me'ilah. How can you say that by me'ilah shim niskaven l'schaven begizei chulin v'nischaven begizei oila shemal? In a similar case by me'ilah, if he intended to warm himself with the wool of chulin. And he intended to warm himself with the wool of chulin, but it turned out that this wool, this gizeh tzemer, was kachim, was kodesh. So he's mal. He's over milah. Even though he didn't have the intent, he's still mal. It says Chalta b'shgaga by mi'ila. So it's Chalta b'shgaga in any event, even if he didn't have kavanah. Now by Shabbos there's some lachs machshavas. By other isurim it says Chaltosa shechata ba. So we learn out that shechata ba is to tell you it has to be with a specific kavanah for this thing. But by mi'ila it's just a general term, Chalta b'shgaga. And therefore, by Me'ilah, even if he did not have the particular kavanah, nevertheless, he's still over Me'ilah. So what are you telling me that a kal v'chaimer, that by shar mitzvahs, if there's no carbon b'mezid, kal v'chaimer, there's no carbon by Me'ilah b'mezid, but Me'ilah has a chomra. Me'ilah is chayev, b'shein miskaven. Rav Nachman Yitzchak Homer, now he says again very similar pshat. It's just that he has an amendment in the Eina Miskaven, in the definition of Eina Miskaven. He defined the Eina Miskaven the same way as we just defined it before. So he says, Hachi Kamar, Lo im amrat b'shar mitzvahs kein lo mischayv b'hen she'ein misasek misasek. By shar mitzvahs, if a person is misasek, which we'll define in a moment, he's potter. Mashen came by Me'ilah, where if he's misasek, he's chayiv. So therefore, you can't make a kal v'chaimer. What is that? What do we say shar mitzvahs that he's not chayiv she'ein misasek means she'im niskaven l'hagbiyas atolish, not to cut something which is detached from the ground, as we said before. But if he didn't even want to do the same maisa, he didn't even want to do the maisa of cutting. He wanted to lagbia, to lift up something which he thought was detached from the ground. V'chata chesam achuber. And not only did he not do something which is tolish, not only did he do it to something which was mechuber, but he did a different action as well. It was not makbiyah, he was chata. He cut something that was mechuber. So he's saying that essentially the same type of teres, but he says the patur that we have, that patur we're saying by Shabbos, or patur by shar mitzvahs, it has to be a greater level of not miskaven. It means not only that it was not miskaven to have this result, but he didn't even intend to do this action. He was intended to hagba, and it was chatach, and he cut. He intended to lift up, and he cut. And he intended to do to an object that was talish, and it was an object that was mechuber. So by Shabbos, by shar mitzvahs, you're potter in such a case. Time of Me'ilah, but my Me'ilah, it's more chomer, because in a similar type of case by Me'ilah, you'd be chayiv. Time of Me'ilah, shim hoisha yor al kli little chayfetz, v'sach yor b'shemen, if he stuck his hand into, let's say there was a cupboard or something to take a container, but inadvertently he poured on his hand shemen shel kodesh. So he got hana from sicha of the shemen shel kodesh. Now here it's the same two things. He didn't intend to do kodesh, he intended to do chulin, but he did kodesh, and he intended to be Moshe, not to be Sach, and he was Sach. He did a different action than he intended. Shemal, but by Mil you're Chay. And therefore, you have a Pircha on the Kal V'chaimer. That's the Pircha on the Kal V'chaimer. So you have these other two pshatim in how to be Mefarish this brisa. Now, Gemara goes back, returns to the brisa that we mentioned before on Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, and the brisa says as follows: Amar Mar, what is the case we say that truma can be chometz? That's a b'mafresh truma v'echmitza. That is, if a person, he was mafresh truma. It wasn't chometz at the time that he was mafresh the truma. It was not chometz v'echmitza, and it became chometz. Or alternatively, the Gemara could have said that he's mafresh the truma that was chometz before Pesach. Aval hivrish chometz truma, but if on Pesach he was mafresh chometz for truma, or for something which is already chometz, it's chometz on Pesach, and he's mafresh on Pesach, they recall any kedusha does not have kedusha. It's not kaddish. It's not chal on it, the truma. Menani mili, where do we know this from? Amr of Nachman bar Yitzchak, Amr Kro, the pasuk says, Titin loy. It says you give the truma to the kain. Loy, it should be given to him. V'loy lo'ire. You have to give him something that he can consume, not something that he can only use as firewood, as fuel. So hummus on Pesach, he can't consume it. So therefore, it's not chal on it. It doesn't have on it the din of it's not chal on it that it can be truma, because it has to be something that he can consume. So even according to Rav Yosef Glili, who holds that it's mutar b'hana, but it's not mutar b'achil, of course, and therefore it's not chal on it the din of truma, because it's not considered titain loy. Most of Rav Huna Brei Yeshua. Yes, if only kasha ain't termina tamei l'tayr. You cannot be term. You cannot take truma from something which is tomei, that it should be pater. It should now remove the tevel from something which is tar. So you can't be termed the tmeya for something which is tar. V'im toram, if you did b'shoigeg trumosa truma. If you did a b'shoigeg, it's chal. The truma is truma. So you can't be termed on tmeya al tzahara, that it has to be something which is not inferior. You can't be tayyim something which is less value on something that should be truma for the item that has a greater value. Now truma tameya has a lesser value. It can't be eaten. It can only be used as fuel. It can't be eaten. So therefore it's also to do it. But b'shoigeg, if you did it, we say it's chal. Truma also truma. V'amai, why should that be? Even if it's a shoygeg, he has to be given something that he can consume. If the truma is tameya, he can't consume it. So even b'shoygeg, it should not be chal. Even b'di'evet, it should not be chal. More answers like kasha, hasam ha'isla shasa kasha. Now, it is considered that it's something that it's titain loy. Now, even though at the time he was mafresh it cannot be consumed, but it's something that at one point, initially, it could be consumed. Before it was tomei, we're talking in a case where it has ha'isla shasa kasha. We're talking in a case where there was a point in time when it was tahar. It could have been given to the kain at that time as something which is truma, titain loy, which he can consume. It had a shasa kaser, meaning that after it was picked from the ground, and it could have been truma, it was not yet tomei. It only became tomei later. But in the case of the chametz, what we're talking about, it never had a shasa kaser. It was chametz from its inception. It never had. What's the case? That before it was harvested, it was still attached to the ground. It was chametz at that point. So at the time when after the harvest, when he could have now be mafresh for truma, it was already chametz. It was already chametz, and it didn't have a shasa kaisha. So therefore, in such a case, that's what we're talking over here. That's not titain loy, because it never had a shasa kaisha. Now, the Shuvas Rashba says that normally when we say something is growing from the ground, it can't become chametz. But the case that we're talking about over here is that it was growing from the ground, but it was already fully ripe, and it didn't need the ground anymore. It was oimed to be harvested. So in such a case where it does not need to derive any nourishment from the ground anymore, it's fully ripe, then it could become chametz. So, aval achmitz betolu shachanami the kadsha. You mean to say that if it became chametz only later, after it was harvested, then you would say it is kaddish, it could become truma? Then you would say because it had a shasa kaisher that it would be kaddish? Amrlei, Rav Nachman Yitzchak said, yes, he said this is the correct pshat, So, in B'Gzeres Irim Pisgama, Mamar Kadishan She'elsa, he says this was decided accordingly by the Malachim and by the words of those who are Kodesh. And he said that, yes, and they were passed in the base medrash like this, my ruling, like my halacha, like this pshat. So he said that as long as it had a shasa kaisher, even though right now the kohen cannot consume it, it's Kaddish. But he also, Rav Huna B'Reid Yeshua, he said, no. He disagreed with that. He said, Omar, he said the Pasuk, Omar Koracious. This says that Truma is called Racious. So this is, you're separating it, and this is called the Racious, which means it's distinct and separate from the remainder, from the Shirayim. So Kar says Racious, the first of what you gather from the grain, it means Shishira Nikarim Yisrael, that this goes to the Kayan. And it's Nikar, the remainder, the balance, is Yisrael. So it shows that there is a difference between the two. That this goes to the Kayan, and now the remainder is mutter to the Yisrael. So Yatzazu, but if you're telling me that this case is that it's already Chometz, so Yatzazu, Shen Shirah Nikar. But over here there's ain't Shirah Nikar, because if it's already Chometz and he's mafresh and he gives it to the Kayan, so the remainder is also to Yisrael. So there's no nikir, there's nothing nikir over here. It was, when we say you're mafresh, it's rachis to the kain, that means the shirayim, it's nikir, that's to the Yisrael, and it's mutter to Yisrael. But if you're talking over here, telling me the case is talking where it's already chometz, you give the trumas to the kain, the remainder, it's chometz, it's Pesach, it's also to the Yisrael. So there's no heker. Even if you say that it's a mutter bahana, like Rav Yossi Galili, but before your mafresh, the towel is also mutter bahana. So there's no heker. So therefore, he argues and he says, in such a case, if it's already chometz, it will not be chal. It will not be kaddish.